Today we're going to be working with fractions and decimals on real-world problems. The number one tip today is going to be if you are stuck on a fraction or decimal word problem to make the numbers easier in the problem to try and figure out what operation to do. So I would suggest using 10 and 2, and that will make it like a third grade or a fourth grade word problem instead of a more difficult problem with decimals and fractions. So our first objective is we're going to be multiplying decimals to solve real-world problems. This should be a review from a prior year where you've already learned to multiply fractions. So we're just multiplying decimals. So we're going to look at this problem. The cost of carpeting a square yard is $8.60. So that you can think of this as if I have 1 square yard, it's going to cost me $8.60. So it's $8.60 per 1 yard that I carpet. How much does it cost to carpet 9 7/10 square yards? So I'm just going to take $8.60 times 9 7/10 square yards. So we treat the dollars just as we would a decimal without the dollar sign. And remember, when you multiply decimals, you do not line up the place value like you would with addition or subtraction. And so I would just go through and multiply. Then you move over to the 9. Then you add these. And then I have 2 decimal point places here and 1 here. So 2 plus 1 is 3. So I go 1, 2, 3 decimal places in, and I get $83.42. I cannot leave that 0 on there if I'm going to write in the proper form of money. So I would write $83.42. You can see that that matches the answer that was given to you there. The second objective is to divide decimals to solve real-world problems. A roll of cloth 12 meters long is cut into smaller pieces. So when we see something like that, we know that we're cutting or dividing this roll of cloth into those sections. Each piece, so that's of the smaller pieces, is 7/500 meters long. How many small pieces can be cut? So I would have the whole of the 12 meters. This is one part, and I'm looking for the other part. So I have 12 meters divided by 7/500. Remember, the goal is to get the decimal point out of the divisor. So I'm going to multiply this times 100 and this number times 100. So now I have 1,200 divided by 75. You guys should all know how to do that. You've been doing that for a long time. So 75 goes into 120 one time. And then you subtract, and eventually you'll find that it is 16 pieces. You can always, after you do your work on your paper, you can always check it with a calculator. These two problems will be on your test, and you will practice this with number 1 on page 105. And then this one will be on your test as well, and you will practice it with number 2 on page 105. Okay. This third objective is essentially the same as the second objective. It's just to divide a whole number by a fraction. So instead of a decimal, you're going to have a whole number and a fraction and solve 2-step problems. So you have a paper artist using 18 paper rectangles. So that's the whole. He uses 6 of them for the border of the artwork. So we're not dividing there. That's simply subtracting 18 minus 6 because he's using 6. So that means I have 12 left over. He then cuts the remaining. This is the 12 remaining. So the first step of our problem is simply subtraction. So he cuts the 12 remaining paper rectangles into equal strips. When I see equal strips, I know I'm dividing each 1/4 of a paper rectangle. So I'm going to do 12 divided by 1/4. If your brain likes to work with decimals, you could always change this 1/4 into 2500ths, which would be 0.25, and then your answer would have to be either in a fraction or a whole number. So 12 divided by 1/4. Remember, when we divide by a fraction, we do keep, change, flip. I never change my first number. That's why it says keep. I keep it the same. I change the operation to the opposite, so multiply, and then I flip my second fraction to the reciprocal. So 12 times 4 is 48. 1 times 1 would be 1, so this would be over 1. So it would be 48 strips remaining. Then my next objective is to divide a whole number by a fraction to solve multi-step problems. So the same as the other one. This one will be practiced using number 3 on page 105, if you need more practice on that. But essentially it's the same as the other, but just opposite. So instead of subtracting a whole number first, you're going to subtract a fraction first. So 75 cups of cranberry apple juice, she uses 2/5 of the juice. So you're going to find out what 2/5 of 75 is. So you can either do 1 whole as the 75 cups, or you could take 75 times 2/5 to find out how much 2/5 of 75 is, and then subtract that from the 75. So after you found this amount, then you would have to do 75 minus whatever that amount was to get the remaining. She then uses the remaining juice, which would be this, to pour single servings that are 5/6 of a cup each. So you would have to find the remaining, which ends up being 45, and divide that by 5/6. So remember, after you dividing a whole number by a fraction, you would have to do keep, change, flip. Objective 5 is you have to decide whether to round up or round down to solve real-world problems. So in real life, sometimes we have to do rounding because we can't have something like half of a person. That would be silly. So this can be practiced with number 4, 5, 6 on page 105 or number 9 on page 106. So we have Meredith bakes 5 pumpkin pies. She cuts the pies into quarters and distributes the pieces equally among her neighbors. Each neighbor receives 3/4 of a pie. So we have her baking 5 pumpkin pies. If you wanted to find out how many pieces there were, you could do 5 times the 4 because she cut them into quarters. And that would be 20 pieces, but we may not need to know that. And then she gives her neighbor 3/4 of a pie. So if we have how many neighbors she needs to distribute the pie to, we do 5 divided by 3/4, and you get 6 2/3. But remember, she can't have 2/3 of a neighbor. So we have to either round up or round down. So if she only has 6 2/3 that she could deliver to, I can't round up to 7 because that 7th neighbor isn't going to get a whole 3/4 of a pie. So I have to round down to 6 neighbors, and then Meredith is just going to keep the other 2/3. And then I have to find out what fraction of a pie is left. So I have to find the neighbors and multiply it times how much each pie gets, how much each neighbor receives. So 6 neighbors times 3/4 of a pie would equal 4.5 pies. So some of you might have been thinking it was just the 2/3, but that's the 2/3 of a neighbor. So I could take 2/3 times 3/4, and that would tell me how much she should have left. Or you do the 6 neighbors times 3/4. She has 4.5 pies. Subtract that from the total pie, and she should have 1/2 of a pie left, which should be the same if you multiply this, which would be 6/12, which would simplify to 1/2 left. And then what's the total amount of pies each neighbor will receive if the remainder is evenly divided and distributed to each neighbor? So remember, we had 6 neighbors. So the remainder of the pie is plus the original is given to the neighbors. So we can't just split the half into 6 neighbors. We have to split the remainder plus the original given. So we have the 5 pies divided by 6 neighbors would equal 5/6 of a pie in total. You could take half of a pie divided by 6 and add it to the amount they originally got, which was 3/4 of a pie. You'd have to have a common denominator when you add the fractions, but you could do it either way. And then we have divide a fraction by a whole number. So instead of having the whole number first, you would have the fraction first, but you'd still do the keep change flip. This is like number 8 on page 106. So we have Lillian has a part-time job. Each month she spends 1/3 of her earnings on clothing. So you can see that here. So this is all of her job. So 1/3 of her earnings on clothes. She saves 3/8 of the remainder. So here is the remainder. You can see that. And she saves 3/8 of it. So 1, 2, 3 out of the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parts, and spends the rest on food. So this would be the rest of the remainder. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/8 of the rest on food. So it's not 5/8 of her whole, but it's 5/8 of the remainder. What fraction of her earnings does she spend on food? So you could do this either with the picture and say it's 5/8 here, but you can see that it's 12 total parts, so it would be 5/12. That's how you would have solved this problem in the past with a bar model. Or you can do, she has 1 whole month, subtract 1/3, which equals 2/3 for the remainder. And then you split the 2/3 into 8, so you would say 2/3 times 3/8 that she spends on, or sorry, that she saves. So it would be 6/24. And so I know if this is the amount she saves of the remainder, I know that she keeps 5/8 for the food. So 2/3 times 5/8 would be 10/24, which simplifies to 5/12, which is your answer. So if I had simplified this amount, it would have been 3/12. So if her earnings are $540, what does she spend on food each month? So then you need to take the 540 times the 5/12 that she makes on food, or that she spends on food. So, or you could take 540, divide it by the 12 total parts, and then take it times the 5 parts.